Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the Spanish conquest of the indigenous peoples of Central and South America, right? We were talking about, or left off talking about in class, of course, the story of Hernan Cortez and his conquest of the Aztecs, right? We were discussing the entire interactions between Cortez and Moctezuma and how, Cortez wasn't even supposed to be the guy that was supposed to go, right? And then the flip last class, we were talking about, disease and how that's going to be a prevalent factor, and then also how the weaponry and metallurgy of the Spanish is going to be that of not more advanced quote unquote than the natives. Well, I mean it was, but also at the same time the natives just didn't have access to large domesticated animals or forgeable metals and things of that sort, right? But where we left off in the story of Cortez and the Aztecs was right there after, of course, Cortez shows up even after being sent gifts by Moctezuma, which is very rude if somebody sends you gifts, right? So and then also of course he's going to be making allies with those large Native American communities that the Aztecs had already taken over, right? And so then we also talked about how when Cortez showed up, Moctezuma welcomed Cortez with open arms, right? Threw the doors open, was like, "What's up, big guy? All right, let's get after it." And then they started discussing, and of course things went south when Moctezuma and the Aztecs began to resist Christianity, right? Now what's going to end up happening though is because of this resistance, Moctezuma is going to be taken prisoner by Cortez and to gain control of the gold and treasure of Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztecs, right? Now, when we're looking at this, we need to also understand that Moctezuma was viewed by his people as a god on earth, right? They viewed him as an extension of their religious structure, right? So whenever Cortez brought him out onto this balcony to speak to his people about collecting the gold and putting down their arms and weapons, what ends up happening is the Aztecs are apparently, according to the story, is that the Aztecs are our God king would never say that, and they all started picking up rocks and hucking them at Moctezuma, thinking he might be an imposter, right? And Moctezuma ends up dying in this instance. Now, interestingly enough, though, as well, the Aztecs are going to fight back, right? They're going to fight back, and they're actually going to drive the Spanish completely out of Tenochtitlan. But the problem was, y'all, is remember that the Cortez is not going to be stopped, and then also the Spanish colonizers and conquistadors are probably not going to be stopped either, right? Now, Cortez is going to come back with a very, very large military force and destroy Tenochtitlan, and he was very, how do I say this? Doing this, okay, which some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, I'm confused. There's still millions of Aztecs where there are still only a few hundred Spanish and maybe a few thousand of the other people that the Aztecs have already taken over, right? You are correct, but the thing that you need to understand is that smallpox is going to take a heavy toll on the Aztec community, though, as well, okay? So what's going to end up happening in this moment is that once Cortez and his conquistadors showed up through the doors, they had already brought with them things like smallpox, measles, and influenza, and it began to spread rapidly throughout Tenochtitlan, right? And they actually stormed in, took over the entire area, and all that remains of Tenochtitlan today are very, very small remnants and artifacts. And then in the process, they are going to begin a colonization effort where they begin to deconstruct Tenochtitlan and then begin to set up colonies, gold and silver mines, and also plantations on top of that land, right? But the thing about it, though, is that the Aztecs are not the only group of people or only civilized people. Now, another big thing that we're going to be talking about, though, as well, is there is another culture of people that is actually right down in South America, and they are known as the Inca. And the explorer or conquistador known as Francisco Pizarro is going to be the guy that actually interacts with them, right? Now, going into it, what you need to understand is that Francisco Pizarro, one, is a cousin of Hernan Cortez. Of course he is. Now, he wants to actually take over the Inca, which live in modern-day Peru. Now, another thing about them, just like we were talking about with the Aztecs, is they are also super advanced, right? When we're looking at, actually tribal organizations in the world, you got to understand that the Inca were phenomenally intelligent, right? Phenomenally intelligent. They had apparently they might be some of the very first people to perform, skull and brain surgery, possibly. They had actually harnessed antiseptic plants and things like that from the rainforests and jungles that surround the Peruvian, the Peruvian Andes, and also the valleys of the Peruvian, Andes Mountains. And we also know that they even were able to basically conquer the elevation of the Andes. These people literally built on top of mountains, right? That's how intelligent the Incan people were. And a lot of y'all have actually interacted with some things of the Inca before. If you've ever seen the movie The Emperor's New Groove, right? Which is a Disney movie, which I highly recommend that you watch because it's very, very good. But really, really quickly when we're getting into it, that is why the character in An Emperor's New Groove, Cusco, is actually named Cusco because their largest capital city was called Cusco, right? Now, this one, though, you've probably seen a picture of before. This is not their capital city. This is actually their mountaintop religious city. This is one known as Machu Picchu, right? And looking at Machu Picchu, you can tell that they were able to literally build their cities on top of mountains. They had over 10,000 miles of trade routes that winded and weaved their way between the Andes Mountains all over Peru and going all the way down as far as northern Chile. Now, when we're talking about this as well, though, they did all of this without even having a written language, right? The Inca didn't have a written language. They actually only had a numbering system, right? And this right here is their numbering system. We don't know how they used it, but we do know they used these threads and knots to actually keep track of certain items on their trade routes, right? They were actually called quipus. Quipu is spelled Q-U-I-P-O, right? And quipus were actually a very, very intelligent way for keeping track of those goods that were going around the trade routes. They also are the only Native American civilization to domesticate really rather large breed animals, right? They domesticated, of course, none other than the llama, right? The llama, which is a cousin of camels, right? And a cousin of the camels that actually lived in North America and some of the early megafauna that actually lived in North America before they were actually gone extinct by the Pleistocene epoch. Now, the thing about it, though, is a relative of those is known as the llama, right? Now, the interesting thing about the llama, though, is that well, some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, Europeans were riding horses. How come the Incans aren't riding llamas, right? Well, the thing about it that you have to understand is that llamas can't carry that much weight, okay? Llamas are pack animals that can only carry about like 60-ish pounds on their back before it starts to get really, really stressful on them. So the thing about it is they aren't like the real large beast of burden like ox or cow or bovine or swine that the Europeans actually had access to. And they didn't have them in great grand numbers that's going to lead to the transference of disease that, of course, is going to give the immunity to the Europeans, but no immunity to things like smallpox, measles, and influenza to the actual natives, which is going to be a massive crisis. But the interesting thing about it, though, is using llamas and using sophisticated farming techniques, the Incans were even able to farm into the sides of mountains, right? If we're looking very closely right here, this is their technique. It's called step farming, right? They would literally cut and edge the areas out of the mountain itself, right? And so literally, if this was the side of a mountain, right? If this sticky note was the side of a mountain and it was edged like that, they would literally just dig into it and then create like a stair step, basically, so they could then just like farm on this flat surface, right? And you can actually see it really closely as they would just like farm on these flattened out surfaces that they would actually excavate using tools and like simple like stone tools as well. Now, going into it though, also this sophisticated thing, also one thing that they actually farmed in that area, three things they farmed in that area were guinea pigs, and then they also farmed quinoa, which some of y'all have ever actually had before, is the grain that actually comes from the ancient Incans, and the other one is potatoes, right? Potatoes were actually originally farmed by the Incans, and the Europeans, when they interact with them, are going to be mind blown by the use of them. Now, just like the Aztecs, though, as well, we need to understand that the Incans actually performed human sacrifice also, except the Incans would sacrifice children, right? They sacrificed children in their religious ceremonies, and it wasn't taken from other villages like the Aztecs were. The Aztecs, for example, took people that they had conquered and then like brought like those people over as forms of human sacrifice against their will, whereas in Incan communities, it was considered a great honor to have your child sacrificed, right? Considered a great honor to be sacrificed in their entire religious structure. And this person right here, that is an Incan mummy who's several hundred years old, because they would actually sacrifice the child by either strangulation or bludgeoning, and then they would mummify the bodies. And look how well preserved she is. Literally, it looks like she could almost just stand up and start talking to you, right? Now, the thing about it that's very, very crazy as well is that right there is Pizarro, and this is their king, or their new king, actually, when Pizarro shows up. His name is King Atahualpa, right? And we'll talk about Atahualpa here in a little bit, but something that you need to understand about the conquest of the Incans by the Spanish is that Pizarro is coming at a very advantageous time for him, right? He's coming at a very advantageous time with only a few hundred soldiers, and he actually is showing up when the Incans still have thousands of soldiers. The Spanish only have a few hundred, but the reason why the Incans were kind of battered and bruised a little bit is because their numbers were very low from a civil war. Now, interestingly enough, the war itself was being fought by Atahualpa, the king of the Incans right here, and his brother, who were actually competing for the crown of the Incans and the Incan people, okay? Now, another thing that you need to understand, though, is that Atahualpa, the king of the Incans, is actually going to win that civil war against his brother and take control of these areas. Now, during this time period when he actually comes to power and Atahualpa is now the king of the Incans, he's noticing a couple of things, right? One, he's noticing and hearing rumors of these people that are showing up with these really advanced weapons and all of these things, and he's referring to the Europeans. And the other thing he's seeing is that people are dying from a sickness, right? And a lot of his people are dying from a sickness that he just can't wrap his mind around, and it's none other than smallpox, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that Pizarro apparently landed right near Peru and was marching his way towards the Incan capital cities. Well, Atahualpa comes up with a plan, and he's like, look, they have only but a few hundred. We have thousands of soldiers, right? Thousands of soldiers. So let's set a trap, right? Now, this is a really crazy event in history, and it's known as the Battle of Cajamarca, right? And at the Battle of Cajamarca, what actually ended up happening is the Incans set up a trap for, Pizarro and his men. And the plan was that they were going to lure them into a square, right? And that square had like a couple of little openings and stuff, and it was in a small village known as Cajamarca, right? And what I mean by a square is kind of like a big open area, almost like a park or something like that, right? As you can see right here. And the plan was that Atahualpa was going to stream in here and bring a huge army into the middle of that square. And when he was ready, he was going to snap his fingers or give a signal of some type, and they were going to jump the conquistadors and then run them out, right? They were going to run them out, and this was supposed to be a grand plan. Well, Pizarro, knowing that this is coming, or assuming that it's coming, actually hid his men around the outside of the square, in the trees and the homes and the buildings all the way around the edges. So when Atahualpa arrived inside the square, first of all, he didn't walk in. This is really a dope thing about this entire interest. He actually rode in on this thing called a litter, right? A litter is literally like, imagine a stretcher that's being carried on people's shoulders, and he was like sitting up on top of it on a throne, just like being brought in with thousands of soldiers all around him. Now, when he comes in, though, he doesn't see any Spanish people. They're nowhere to be seen, right? They're nowhere to be seen. He's like, where are these guys? I was just trying to set a trap for them. And then all of a sudden, a priest walks out, right? A priest walks out and begins to speak to him in Spanish. And Atahualpa's like, what's this guy saying? I don't know what this guy's saying. What is he saying? And so, like, literally what ends up happening, though, also the priest walks up to him and he hands him a book, right? He hands him a book. He's like, you must submit to the will of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he hands Atahualpa a Bible, right? Hands him a Bible, and Atahualpa looks at it, opens it up, and he's like, what is all these little squiggly marks on these pages? I don't know what this is. Because remember, the Incans don't have a written language, so he just simply took the Bible and he threw it. Like he threw it down and stuff like that, and the priest freaked out, threw his hands up, and then gave a signal, and all of a sudden, the other Spanish, like the soldiers, there may have been thousands of Incan soldiers and only a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but they got the element of surprise. And they started firing their guns and firing their cannons and running out in horses and stuff like that. And they massacred the Incan soldiers that were there, right? Several hundred Incans died, and not a single Spanish soldier died at the Battle of Cajamarca. Because you have to understand, the Incan soldiers that arrived were wearing cloth armor and carrying stone weapons like these that you see right here. One of the most famous ones is actually called a bolas, and a bolas looks like this. But you swing that against an iron sword or against a gun, and you have no chance, right? So the Spanish actually took over the Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca and took him prisoner, right? You can actually see Atahualpa right here in this very famous painting, sitting on top of his litter. Here is Pizarro trying to take possession of Atahualpa. Here are the Incans cowering in the background and dying from the mass, the jumping that is occurring. And then right here is the priest pointing to the symbol of Christ, and the guy that actually sent the signal for the actual trap to be sprung on the Incans when they thought they were actually springing a trap on the Spanish, right? Now, Atahualpa, though, was taken hostage and held for ransom, much like Moctezuma was as well. But what ends up happening is they actually demand that they fill 2 rooms of gold from floor to ceiling to pay for Atahualpa's release. And guess what? The Incans paid it. The Incans paid it because they actually had a lot of gold and silver lying around, right? The Incans paid the ransom, but then the Spanish are going to decide, you know what, we'd be better off if Atahualpa just wasn't alive, right? And they literally just killed him anyway, right? They killed him anyway. They strangled him to death. And for those of you who actually had Mr. Watterson last year, probably heard about that thing. It's called a garrote, where literally they went down and they actually strangled him to death while he's sitting in a chair. And then they burned his body, which was also then considered a massive insult to him as an Incan because they didn't believe in cremation, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that now that the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans have been basically eradicated and had a genocide against them during this time period, you have to understand that now there's going to be all this land available, right? So what's going to happen is the Spanish are going to begin to colonize that land, right? Now, by the mid-1500s, Spain claimed a vast empire. Now, remember, too, also, you've got 1519 is going to be Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs, right? And that actually is only 2 years after the Reformation started under Luther in 1517. But that is going to begin those those efforts, right? But by the mid-1500s, the 1550s, Spain claimed a huge empire that stretched from California all the way to South America. So everything you see in red right there is something that was formerly owned by the Spanish Empire at one point or another, right? Now, going into it, though, what are their biggest motivators? Like, what is being motivated? What is motivating the Spanish to do all this and to colonize all of this area, take over all these people, go to these different places, and try to get all this land when they have land and money back in Spain? But what is motivating them now? And it's three big things that all start with a G. It's God, gold, and glory. You'll hear about this in college. You'll hear professors talk about this. You'll hear professors and historians and academians talk about how God, gold, and glory were the biggest motivators for the Europeans in their conquest. Now, we'll talk specifically about God and gold. Glory we won't talk too much about because it's kind of self-explanatory, right? It's a little bit on the self-explanatory side because it's like, oh, you just want more stuff and more power than your other European neighbors and rivals, right? Now, going into the God premise, though, let's start there, and then we'll talk about gold. You have to understand that the God premise is basically the idea of spreading Christianity, right? Because to Spain, winning souls for Christianity was just as important as land. If we look at all of these paintings, drawings, writings, things like that, the story of the Battle of Cajamarca and all those things, you've got immediate instances of conquistadors trying to convert the natives to Christianity before the acts of violence are then perpetrated. Now, once the Spanish actually tried to get the natives to convert to Christianity and then they refused, the Spanish used this as justification for their violence and aggression and death tolls that could be considered on genocidal levels, right? Now, because literally 90% of all the natives of the Americas, 90% would die from violence or disease, right? Now, going into the next facet, though, the God one is very, very easy. It's just the spread of Christianity, right? Now, controlling trade, though, is going to be the gold motivator, right? When we're talking about gold, we're talking about making money, okay? So you have to understand that first and foremost, the Spain, what they wanted more than anything else was the gold and silver that sat beneath the surface within these areas in Central and South America, right? So using advanced tools, steel and iron tools that the Spanish actually had access to, they gave those to the natives and mines would be dug deeper than they ever had been dug before. The natives had simple mining facilities and simple mining techniques that actually did manage to bring large amounts of gold and silver out of the ground. But where there is some on the surface, there is more beneath the ground. So they then forced the natives to actually dig the mines even deeper than they ever had been dug before. And the natives are going to be forced to work in awful conditions within these mines. As we can see from this engraving right here, which is actually from a Spanish priest, a Spanish priest, you can actually see the awful conditions inside of some of these mines and mountainsides where the actual natives are working in practical darkness and then also using advanced metal tools like these pickaxes to actually dig these mines and mine that gold for the Spanish that they, the natives, would then not even be able to keep. And you saw a massive influx of gold and silver going into places like Spain and Portugal during this time period. Now, funny enough, this is actually going to bite them in the butt a little bit. The thing about it is like this is actually going to cause inflation back inside of Spain. It's actually going to lead to their downfall eventually, as they actually got too rich too fast, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is also looking at it like this and looking at this part of history, you might have deserved it a little bit. So going into it, though, when we're looking at this also controlling trade as well, is it's not just about gold and silver. It's also about growing different goods, right? The colonies would also, though, ship these stuff known as raw materials back to Spain, right? Now, raw materials are things that are grown on these areas that they're colonizing, like foods, cottons, sugar canes, things like that, right? A raw material, what it is any natural good in its unprocessed state, right? So basically what would happen is the Spanish would grow something, like this little pink sticky note I have in my hand, and the Spanish colonists would grow it, send it back to Spain, where it then would be processed into a pack of sticky notes or something like that, right? So a good example of this as well is using the example of cotton, which is originally from the Pakistan area in the Indus Valley. And so the thing about it is they had access to cotton for hundreds of years, but cotton turns out is going to grow really well in the American South, right? So cotton in its unadulterated state is going to be a raw material. This is raw cotton, and you still have to take the seeds out of it and process it. And once you process it in a factory, you can turn it into a textile, right? The raw material, though, is the cotton. The finished product is the cloth itself, right? And then the actual Spanish government would then take that cloth or take these items and then ship it back to the colonists and then sell it back to them for a huge profit. Now, interestingly enough, the thing about it is that in Spain and in the Spanish colonies, cotton was not the big crop grown, okay? That's going to be more of an English crop, right? The thing that is going to be grown heavily by the Spanish, though, is sugarcane, right? Sugarcane is the most profitable crop that can be grown in Central and South America during this time period, as well as in the Caribbean. Now, going into it, you have to understand the process of growing sugarcane, and this is the reason why I don't mind teaching in Louisiana, because y'all know what sugarcane is. I taught in New Jersey for several years, and these kids did not know where sugar came from, right? But y'all do, so this does help us out a little bit. Sugarcane actually is a a product grown from the ground that can make several different items. It can make things like sugar, molasses, and rum, right? All of these items being very, very expensive at the time and being very helpful when it comes to using things as sweeteners or preservatives, and then rum, of course, being used as an alcoholic beverage, right? Now, going into it, though, also, but just like the mines, the sugarcane plantations required a very large workforce because, as you can see, sugarcane, as it begins to grow, must then be harvested and cut down, and they didn't have modern technology like seen here. That is a modern-day sugarcane thresher that actually will thresh either sugar beets or sugar cane and then actually process it into the sugar that sits on your table. Now, during the time period that we're talking about, though, in the 1500s going into the 1600s, these are sugarcane plantations that required basic labor, like hand-on tool labor to plant it, grow it, and harvest it, right? Which is going to lead to the need for massive workforces, right? Now, speaking of workforces, where are they going to get this workforce from? Now, originally, you saw in that image right there, you saw a use of African slave-based systems. That was not the first system used. The encomienda is the actual first system ever used. The encomienda, what it is a system of forced labor that the Spanish colonists are going to exact onto the natives, right? They actually forced the natives to work by law, right? They literally actually said for all of the natives that had not died from smallpox, measles, or influenza, they would be forced to then work, right? And the natives were not allowed to refuse. What would happen is if they refused is they could be arrested, tortured, and their family could even be taken hostage, right? Which is absolutely wild. And so what ends up going down, though, is the encomienda had like a plan by the Spanish government, and then it had a reality, right? The plan for the encomienda was that Spanish settlers would protect, care for, and help give the natives Christianity. And then in return, the natives would work a portion of their time for the Spanish settlers. But in reality, what actually happened is that Spanish settlers forced long labor, did not pay the native workers, and failed to protect them, and they would seize Native American lands as the tribes began to die off. The natives are going to die from disease and the harsh living and working conditions put forward by this. And the encomienda system wouldn't even stop until after several Indian revolts and several other Spanish settlers were like, y'all, this is really screwed up. We must stop this, right? And that is why at least 90% of the natives are actually going to die from these conditions. Natives worked mainly in the mines and on sugarcane plantations. The mines killed thousands of natives through poor conditions, no ventilation, exhaustion, and 90% of them are going to actually end up perishing due to the encomienda system and the disease that was spread by the conquistadors. Now, this is going to then cause Europeans to replace their labor with African slaves, right? Because they actually had created the mines and then the plantations as well, and then they begin to actually purchase slaves from Africa, which is absolutely disgusting. We'll talk about the backlash of the African slave trade system and as well, and then we're going to talk a little bit about in class about the growth of colonies a little bit more as well. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.